In 1989, a journalist wrote that whenever Vivien was mentioned, the busiest heart surgeon in the world would stop and chat with you for an hour. When the journalist first visited Dr. Dan, one of the most renowned cardiac surgery directors in the country, there was only a 47-minute gap between the surgeries. Surprisingly, the doctor's secretary said, "No, you don't need an appointment. The doctor is here and he wants to talk to you right now." So who exactly is Vivien? Is he the slender man in the photo? What magic does he have to captivate the most rigorous doctors in the world? This turns out to be a true story, often referred to by doctors as a masterpiece of God. Let's go back to 1930. A janitor was secretly browsing through medical books on a bookshelf when a professor noticed him from outside the window. The professor asked to see the janitor's hands. He then placed a surgical clamp on the janitor's hand and asked him to pick up a test tube on the table. The janitor did it effortlessly. The professor then put another clamp on his left hand, and the janitor again handled it with precision. The janitor then skillfully placed the two test tubes back into their holders and picked up two rubber stoppers, placing them back onto the reagent box. There was no doubt these were hands made for surgery. It wasn't just about steadiness and accuracy. Many medical students are tested this way in their first class. Instead of a scolding or a terrifying dissection, these tests are designed to increase your psychological pressure. Steady hands are not enough. Many carpenters and masons have steady hands. But when you step onto the operating table and hold a living life in your hands, do you have the courage to remain steady? This was the greatest shock the janitor gave the professor. He came from humble beginnings and had only finished high school. But he saved money while working as a carpenter, dreaming of saving enough to attend medical school and become a doctor. The professor was moved by this determination, understanding the strength of such dreams. Professor Blalock was from a prominent Southern family. His cousin had been a Southern president, and his family owned vast tracts of land. A century ago, their plantations spread across the South, but after the Civil War, they became bankers and merchants. The professor genuinely liked the janitor and instructed his assistant to bring a white coat, meaning, "From now on, wear this and be my lab assistant." Thus, we see the young Vivien Thomas in the photo wearing a white coat over his apron, with a smile and eyes full of determination. Vivien's mother had given him this girl's name before he was born. He was exceptionally intelligent, and with his mathematical talent, he was admitted to Pearl High School at a very young age, an academically renowned institution. Here, Vivien was introduced to medicine and decided to become a doctor. By the age of 13, he had completed almost all of the high school curriculum and was about to apply to medical school. However, an economic crisis swept through the South, and the impoverished Thomas family could no longer afford to support the college students. So Vivien left school and worked as a carpenter to support his family, while his brother continued his studies in teaching. Before coming to Professor Blalock's lab, Vivien had already been a carpenter for 7 years. When he got home, his father was not pleased. Being a lab assistant sounded impressive, but the weekly wage was only $12, less than half of what he earned as a carpenter. Fortunately, Vivien had a supportive fiancé. They'd agreed that after working with Professor Blalock for a while and saving $500, plus the money he had saved over 7 years, he would have enough to go to college. Then they would get married, and she would become Mrs. Thomas, the wife of a renowned Southern doctor. As they walked down the street, dreaming of the future, they suddenly saw a crowd at the bank. Vivien went to check and found that the bank had closed. He was confused and asked anxiously, but the people inside said the bank had gone bankrupt. But, my savings are in there. That's my college money." The answer was the same: the bank had failed. Vivien was devastated. This was the Great Depression, and countless banks had collapsed. Vivien was just one of the many affected. His dream of going to college was shattered, and the Thomas family fell deeper into poverty. Yet, his fiancée still encouraged him, saying, "You're already a lab assistant. We can still get married, and I will still be Mrs. Thomas, the wife of a famous doctor." So at this critical moment, his fiancée chose to marry him. At the time, Vivien was 19 and Professor Blalock was 30. Professor Blalock was like someone kissed by God, not only handsome and wealthy but also excelling in both academics and sports. In class, he was the top student at Johns Hopkins Medical School, and on the tennis court, he was the idol who charmed everyone. Most importantly, at night, he was the king of the nightclubs, earning the nickname Playboy. Because of this nickname, the rigorous Johns Hopkins Medical School refused to let him become a doctor. The old professors thought the frivolous young man needed more experience. So, Professor Blalock returned to Vanderbilt University in the South, where he continued his research and training. At the time, Professor Blalock was challenging a common medical belief: was shock really caused by toxins? If so, why hadn't anyone found the toxin in decades? He believed that shock was caused by excessive blood loss. A simple question, but the old professors just couldn't understand. On the day Vivien stumbled into the Playboy's rebellious research, Professor Blalock drew a line on a dog's belly and ordered Vivien to cut along it. Vivien did as instructed, then used a rib spreader to open the wound. The professor was satisfied. This was Vivien's unique method, designed to replicate traumatic shock in dogs. As the dog's blood pressure dropped, the professor said, "The traditional treatment is to constrict the blood vessels, but that won't save it. We should do the opposite, dilate the blood vessels and give it a transfusion." Vivien followed the instructions, but the blood pressure continued to drop. The professor, who had repeated this experiment several times, even joked, "Maybe the old men are right. Shock isn't caused by blood loss, and we should give up." But this time, a miracle happened. The blood pressure began to rise, a sign of life. The professor smiled and said, "I have a feeling. Yes, it's like finding 4,000 bitcoins on an old computer. It's too good to be true." The professor succeeded, but when he looked around for the sphygmomanometer, he realized Vivien hadn't connected it. What's a sphygmomanometer? Vivien was as confused as the audience. The professor, furious, lashed out at Vivien with the harshest words. Vivien felt disappointed. He had thought the professor was different, but now he saw the truth. Vivien took off his white coat. Dignity meant more to him than his dreams. The professor didn't try to stop him. The sphygmomanometer, an ancient vital signs monitor, was essential for recording blood pressure, ECG, and pulse. Without it, the experiment couldn't be replicated or published. It was like finding 4,000 bitcoins, only to have the assistant tell you it was just a screenshot, and the hard drive had been formatted. Who could bear that? The professor was fuming, but then he saw Vivien's handwritten records. Realizing he had wronged Vivien, the professor chased after him, apologizing and offering the white coat. Vivien, having only been there for a month, hadn't been told about the sphygmomanometer. The professor, regretful for his mistake, sincerely apologized. Vivien, not holding a grudge, returned to work. Doctored and told the journalist, like a scalpel and forceps, they worked seamlessly together in the following years. Professor Blalock was sharp and decisive, like a scalpel, while Vivien was steady and composed, like a forceps. Their research on shock and trauma made significant breakthroughs, especially during World War II, when they shared their knowledge with the front lines, saving millions of lives. Professor Blalock was nominated for the Nobel Prize. But behind the glory, Vivien had a different story. One day, a general returning from the front hosted a banquet to thank them. The once arrogant Johns Hopkins professors, now acting as hosts, sincerely invited Professor Blalock to become the head of the surgical department at Johns Hopkins. Professor Blalock accepted, but in his speech he took all the credit, not mentioning Vivien's contributions. Meanwhile, Vivien, due to his status, was serving as a waiter, busy pouring drinks. Vivien didn't complain, but the professor, oblivious, called him to pour more wine. Suddenly, a petite female doctor approached the professor. She introduced herself as Dr. Taussig from Johns Hopkins, specializing in pediatric cardiology and congenital heart defects. The professor told Vivien to pour her a drink, and Dr. Taussig explained her problem: blue babies whose hearts had blocked, causing them to suffocate. It was a death sentence, and the blue babies suffered until they died. Dr. Taussig hoped Professor Blalock could help solve this issue. Hearing this, the professors around him said heart surgery was unprecedented and that any attempt would be fatal. But Professor Blalock, in the midst of their skepticism, began his performance. He outlined a plan, but faltered. Vivien, sensing the moment, suggested, "This might prevent minor ventricular tremors." "Yes, that's it," the professor quickly added. Dr. Taussig was amazed and asked, "Who are you?" Soon, Professor Blalock and Vivien moved to Johns Hopkins. In the hall leading to the lab, the professor pointed out portraits of medical pioneers, including John Hopkins himself, the father of American medicine, and gynecological pioneers. The professor, ambitious, believed he would one day join these luminaries. Vivien, too, dreamed of such recognition. But suddenly, a guard stopped them, insisting that Vivien enter through the back door. Even the professor's intervention couldn't change the rule. Reluctantly, they agreed to meet at the lab. As Vivien turned to leave, the statue of Jesus, symbolizing equality and love, seemed to mock the situation. After clocking in at the back door and putting on his white coat, Vivien faced strange looks. In the lab, a department had even handed him money to buy coffee and bread, ignoring his explanations. This was the tradition and rigor of the medical sanctuary. Vivien's pain deepened. Although his salary increased to $16, he lived in a cramped apartment with his 2 daughters, and life was harder. He didn't complain and threw himself into Dr. Taussig's research. Soon, Vivien saw the blue babies, sitting motionless, their skin a pale blue. Dr. Taussig explained that this position helped reduce their suffering, as their hearts couldn't supply enough oxygen to their lungs. After learning about the condition, even Vivien thought it was too difficult. But Professor Blalock, remembering his own battle with tuberculosis, vowed to challenge death. He proposed recreating the condition in dogs and developing a surgical method. He also suggested that Vivien, using his carpentry skills, create a vascular clamp and a respirator. It sounded easy, but Vivien, who worked 2 hours as a handyman after his shift to support his family, had little energy left. 3 months passed, and they had neither created the respirator nor successfully recreated the condition. Even the professor doubted himself, asking if he was at a dead end. But Vivien calmly suggested trying the opposite approach, which worked. The professor, inspired, proposed creating an artificial shunt between the aortide pulmonary artery. The professor rushed to a surgery, and Vivien, inspired, began experimenting. Soon, when the professor was frustrated, Vivien presented a new respirator. The professor was delighted. During another lecture, Dr. Lilhi saw Vivien's work and was impressed by his skills. When he saw Vivien operating with his eyes closed, he knew Vivien was a master. Vivien explained that it was like walking blindfolded in a familiar room. This technique, known as tactile surgery, is highly advanced. Through relentless effort, they made progress, but challenges persisted. One day, a janitor, seeing Vivien receive extra bread, mocked him, calling him a third-class worker. Vivien, shocked, conferred with the personnel manager, who insisted Vivien was a third-class worker, earning $16 a week. Despite his calm exterior, Vivien was deeply hurt. When the professor, unaware, joked about deducting from his salary, Vivien snapped, took off his coat, and left. The professor, realizing the truth, tried to persuade him, but Vivien, disillusioned, walked away. The professor, seeing the successful replication of the condition, understood Vivien's silent plea for respect. That night, the professor spoke to the dean, demanding a technician title for Vivien. Later, he visited Vivien, offering a raise in compensation. Vivien, moved, returned to the lab. They next planned to treat the condition in dogs. Vivien sketched the treatment, suggesting rerouting the carotid artery to increase blood flow to the lungs. The professor agreed, and they tried it on a dog. During the final suturing, the professor, recognizing the difficulty, let Vivien handle it. When the professor checked the sutures, he said, "It's like a masterpiece of God." Ugh. 2 weeks later, the professor met with the parents of a blue baby, explaining the risks. The parents, unsure, consulted a priest who argued against the surgery, citing divine will. The mother, however, insisted that God's will could include saving her child. The priest, convinced, sought the professor, accusing him of desecrating the divine creation. The professor retorted, "Now, your almighty God wants the child to die, not me. My instinct tells me nature made a mistake, and I can correct it." But soon, the dog that had survived the surgery died. The suture had ruptured. The professor, having boasted of success, was now at a crossroads. Until the next morning, Vivien, awakened by a nightmare, told the professor about a vision of the grown-up blue baby who died, his heart still infantile. The professor realized the suture didn't grow with the body. They needed a suture that could expand. The next day, news spread that Professor Blalock was assisting his janitor. Only Vivien could perform the high-precision suturing. They successfully treated the dog, and the professor, determined, scheduled the surgery for the blue baby. The night before, the professor, sleepless, wrote, "Am one madly pushing myself over the cliff?" On November 29, 1944, the surgery gathered over 10 medical experts. The professor, unable to start, ran out and called for Vivien. Finally, with Vivien's guidance, the surgery proceeded. As the baby's blood pressure dropped, the professor, facing death, used Vivien's special clamp. The final suturing was tense, but the baby's color improved and the surgery succeeded. This was the first successful heart surgery in history. The professor received acclaim, and blue babies from Europe and North America flocked to Johns Hopkins. Countless medical masters visited, but Vivien was always excluded from group photos. The procedure was named the Blalock-Taussig Shunt, seemingly erasing Vivien's contribution. Dr. Dan recalled how Vivien, a teacher by day, served drinks at night. One night, medical students, surprised, saw their professor mixing drinks. The emotional impact was unimaginable, but the real blow came at a banquet in December 1946. Celebrating 200 successful surgeries, the professor was honored, but Vivien, uninvited, snuck in as a waiter. He heard the professor mention everyone except him. 2 days before Christmas, Vivien bid farewell to the professor, returning to the South to provide for his family. Unbeknownst to him, his reputation had spread, and he became a successful pharmaceutical representative. Within 2 years, he owned a car and a house, and his brother, under his influence, won a civil rights lawsuit and became a successful businessman. Yet, material success couldn't fill the void. His wife, noticing his melancholy, suggested he return to his passion. Vivien, 3 years later, knocked on the professor's door. The duo, reunited, continued their groundbreaking work. In 1945, the Blalock-Taussig Shunt was nominated for the Nobel Prize, but the polio vaccine, another medical marvel, overshadowed it. Dr. Dan noted that Vivien, without titles or raises, trained hundreds of cardiac experts, including himself. In 1964, the professor, terminally ill, returned to Johns Hopkins. Vivien, pushing the professor's wheelchair, realized the professor's guilt. The next day, the university lowered its flag for the deceased professor. Years later, Johns Hopkins awarded Vivien an honorary doctorate, and his portrait was hung alongside the professor's. Dr. Dan, sharing this story, hoped it would reach more people. The biography, published in 1989, won awards but remained obscure. Dr. Dan, later awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom, sought his students carry on Vivien's legacy. In 2004, the medical community renamed the procedure the Blalock-Taussig Shunt, finally recognizing Vivien's contribution. In 2019, a 74-year-old man, the 44th blue baby, visited Johns Hopkins, seeking to see the photos of the men who saved his life. Thank you for listening. See you next video.